Imagine a world where every pregnancy was a potential death sentence. In the modern age, we view the arrival of a child as a beginning, but for a woman in the Middle Ages, it was often the beginning of the end. There were no antibiotics, no ultrasounds, and no pain relief, only the flickering light of a tallow candle, the smell of dried herbs, and the terrifying knowledge that 1 in 3 women would not survive their childbearing years. This isn't just history, it is a forgotten horror story written in the blood of our ancestors. This is the disturbing truth about medieval childbirth. In the timber-framed houses of 14th century Europe, a pregnancy was not celebrated with gender reveals or baby showers. Instead, it was met with a grim, quiet preparation for battle. From the moment a woman realized her cycle had stopped, she entered a period known as the shadow. To the medieval mind, the pains of labor were not merely biological, they were a divine punishment. Following the biblical fall of man, it was believed that all women were cursed to bring forth children in sorrow and agony as penance for Eve's original sin. This religious framing meant that seeking too much pain relief was often seen as interfering with God's will. As her belly grew, a medieval woman didn't prepare a nursery, she prepared her soul. It was standard practice for an expectant mother to make her last will and testament and to confess her sins to a priest before the labor pains began. She would choose the shroud she wished to be buried in, just in case the birthing room became a mortuary. The air in these rooms was thick with the scent of rose oil and vinegar, meant to ward off miasma or bad air, but the underlying scent was always fear. There were no doctors. In fact, men were strictly forbidden from the birthing chamber. A man entering this sacred, bloody space could be tried for indecency or even witchcraft. Instead, the mother-to-be was surrounded by god-sibs, female friends, and a local midwife. While these women provided emotional support, their tools were primitive. They relied on amulets, eagle stones tied to the thigh to draw the baby down, and whispered incantations that blurred the line between Christian prayer and pagan magic. They were fighting a war against infection and anatomy with nothing but superstition and courage. The most terrifying aspect was the birthing chair. It was a cold, hard wooden seat with a crescent-shaped cutout designed to let gravity do the work. But as the hours turned into days and the mother's strength failed, the atmosphere would shift from hopeful chanting to desperate hysteria. If the baby was malpresented, breech, or transverse, the midwife had no surgical tools. She had only her hands, often unwashed, and the knowledge that if the child did not come out soon, both mother and babe would be lost to the milk fever or the slow, agonizing rot of sepsis. As the labor progressed into its 2nd or 3rd day, the air in the birthing chamber would grow heavy, not just with the heat of the fire, but with the palpable scent of desperation. In the Middle Ages, the midwife was the most powerful person in the room, yet she worked in a vacuum of scientific knowledge. Her toolkit was a strange blend of practical folk medicine and terrifying superstition. To help a struggling mother, she might use sneezing powders made of pepper or crushed hellebore, believing that a violent sneeze could physically force the baby out of the womb. If that failed, the mother might be forced to walk up and down steep stairs or be shaken vigorously in a blanket, a practice that often caused more internal damage than help. But the most disturbing methods were the ones used when nature stalled. When the natural heat of the mother was thought to be fading, midwives would resort to sympathetic magic. They would unlock every door in the house, untie every knot in the mother's clothing, and even unbraid her hair, believing that these physical acts of opening would magically compel the cervix to do the same. If the baby was stuck, the midwife might reach inside with hands lubricated only by lily oil or hog's lard. Without the concept of germ theory, these examinations were often a death sentence, introducing lethal bacteria directly into the mother's bloodstream, leading to the dreaded childbed fever. Religion provided the only anesthesia available.
A woman in agony would be draped in relics, perhaps a piece of parchment written with a saint's name on it, or a birthing girdle borrowed from a local convent. These girdles were long strips of silk or parchment covered in prayers and images of the Passion of Christ. They were wrapped tightly around the laboring woman's abdomen, a physical weight meant to provide spiritual protection. But as the screams intensified, the prayers often turned to frantic pleas. If the midwife suspected the baby was dying inside, the priority shifted from birth to salvation. The fear of a child dying unbaptized was perhaps greater than the fear of death itself. In a world where an unbaptized soul was believed to be condemned to limbo, midwives were legally authorized by the church to perform emergency baptisms. If only a hand or foot of the baby was visible and the mother was failing, the midwife would sprinkle water on the presenting limb and recite the Latin formula. In some of the most harrowing accounts, midwives used primitive syringes to squirt holy water inside the womb, attempting to save the infant's soul, even if its body could not be saved. This was the brutal reality. The soul mattered more than the flesh, and the chamber of life was rapidly becoming a chamber of ritualistic sacrifice.
When the prayers failed and the midwife's charms proved useless, the atmosphere of the birthing room shifted from desperate hope to cold, clinical horror. If a baby was positioned incorrectly, perhaps sideways or stuck behind the pelvic bone, and could not be moved by hand, the case was deemed obstructed. In the Middle Ages, an obstructed labor was almost always a death sentence for both mother and child. It was at this point, when the mother was delirious with exhaustion and the baby had likely stopped moving, that the barber surgeon might be called, or the midwife would reach for the most feared tools in her kit. The primary goal in these nightmare scenarios was no longer to deliver a living child, it was to save the mother's life at any cost. This led to the most disturbing practice of the medieval era, embryotomy. If the fetus was confirmed dead, or if the mother's life was at its absolute limit, instruments like the crotchet, a sharp metal hook, were used. The surgeon would use these hooks to break the skull of the infant while it was still inside the birth canal to reduce its size, allowing the remains to be extracted. There was no numbing of the senses, no way to dull the psychological trauma of the mother watching her own child be dismantled piece by piece to save her own skin. If the mother died before the baby was born, the horror did not end. Medieval law and religious doctrine often required a post-mortem cesarean. This was not the life-saving surgery we know today. Because the church demanded that every soul be baptized, if a pregnant woman breathed her last breath, the midwife or a bystander was required to cut the mother open immediately to extract the infant. This was done with whatever blade was available, often a kitchen knife or a sewing blade, right there on the bed where the woman had just expired. The goal was to get the baby out while there was still a spark of life, so that it could be splashed with holy water before it too perished. For the few women who survived these gruesome interventions, the aftermath was often a living death. Without modern suturing or knowledge of anatomy, many women were left with fistulas, internal tears that caused permanent incontinence and chronic pain. In a society that valued women primarily for their ability to provide heirs, a woman broken by childbirth was often cast aside, viewed as cursed or unclean. They lived as social outcasts, carrying the physical and emotional scars of the birthing chamber until a secondary infection, like the slow rot of a fever, finally took them. The miracle of life in the medieval world was, in reality, a gauntlet of blood, steel, and unbearable choices. For the woman who successfully navigated the trauma of the birthing chair and the surgeon's blade, the danger was far from over. In fact, for many, the true nightmare began 3 days after the birth. This was the onset of puerperal fever,
or as it was whispered in the villages, the childbed fever. To the medieval eye, a woman who had just survived the war of birth would suddenly fall into a terrifying decline. She would be seized by violent tremors, a racing pulse, and an abdomen so swollen and tender that even the weight of a linen sheet felt like a crushing blow. The disturbing truth was that the very people trying to help her were often the ones who signed her death warrant. The concept of sterile did not exist. Midwives and helpers would move from one laboring woman to the next, or from handling raw meat and garden soil directly to the bedside of a new mother. They carried on their hands an invisible army of bacteria, specifically Streptococcus, which found a perfect breeding ground in the raw, wounded interior of the uterus. Within 48 hours, the infection would turn the blood toxic. The sweet smell of a newborn was replaced by the putrid, sickly smell of internal decay as the mother's body literally began to rot from the inside out. The medieval cure for this fever was as gruesome as the disease itself. Physicians believed the fever was caused by putrid milk migrating from the breasts to the rest of the body, or by an imbalance of the four humors. To balance the mother, they would perform bloodletting. They would slice open the veins in her arms or apply leeches to her inner thighs, draining her of the very fluid she needed to fight the infection. Already weakened by the loss of blood during delivery, these women would drift into a state of muttering delirium, hallucinating in the flickering candlelight until their hearts finally gave out. This invisible killer created a culture of extreme paranoia. If several women in a village died of the fever in 1 month, the community would look for a scapegoat. Often the midwife herself, the woman who had dedicated her life to bringing children into the world, was accused of witchcraft or evil eye. It was easier for the medieval mind to believe in a demonic curse than to accept that a microscopic world was devouring their mothers. A house of joy would be transformed into a house of mourning in a matter of hours, leaving behind a terrified widower and a motherless babe who faced a survival rate of less than 50% without its mother's milk.
In the wake of a mother's death, or in cases where a noblewoman refused to breastfeed to preserve her fertility, the survival of the infant hinged on a transaction of flesh and fluid. This was the era of the wet nurse, a profession born out of biological necessity but steeped in a disturbing class dynamic. For a poor woman, her breast milk was her only currency. To earn enough to feed her own family, she would often have to abandon her own biological child, leaving them with an aging nurse or a relative who would feed them pap, a hazardous mixture of bread, water, and unpasteurized cow's milk that was often crawling with bacteria. The choice of a wet nurse was treated with the same scrutiny one might use to buy a high-bred horse. It was a common medieval belief that a woman's character, temperament, and even her physical moral failings were transmitted through her milk. If a nurse was prone to anger, the baby was thought to grow up violent. If she was lewd, the child would be cursed with lust. Parents would inspect a nurse's teeth, the color of her skin, and even the scent of her milk, dropping a bead of it onto a fingernail to see if it held its shape. If it was too thin, it was watery and weak. If too thick, it was congealed and corrupt. But the reality for these nurses was one of extreme hardship. To keep their milk flowing, they had to remain perpetually in cycle, meaning they often had to neglect their own infants to ensure the survival of a wealthy stranger's heir. This created a tragic hierarchy of survival. The noble child thrived on the milk of a peasant, while the peasant's own child died of malnutrition or summer complaint, severe diarrhea. The mortality rate for children put out to wet nurses was staggering, leading to the grim nickname for these arrangements, baby farming. Furthermore, the lack of hygiene made the act of nursing a gamble. Diseases like scrofola, a form of tuberculosis, were the early stages of the Great Pox, syphilis,
could be passed from nurse to child, or vice versa, through cracked nipples and oral sores. A family might hire a nurse to save their baby, only to unknowingly introduce a slow-acting poison into the nursery. This was the cold, economic truth of the medieval cradle. Life was a commodity, and for one child to live, another often had to starve in the shadows. The bond between mother and child, which we consider sacred today, was frequently severed by the brutal demands of survival and status. In the modern world, we recognize postpartum depression and psychosis as medical emergencies triggered by hormonal shifts and extreme exhaustion. In the medieval ages, these conditions were viewed through a lens of pure supernatural terror. When a mother, already traumatized by the violence of the birthing chair, began to withdraw, weep uncontrollably, or claim she didn't recognize her own child, the community didn't offer therapy. They offered exorcism. They believed that the mother's weakened state had invited demons into the home, or worse, that the fair folk had stolen the real human infant and replaced it with a changeling. The changeling myth was a disturbing psychological shield used to explain away birth defects, colic, or the symptoms of what we now know as autism and failure to thrive. If a baby cried incessantly, refused to grow, or looked different, it was whispered that the child was an elemental creature, a piece of wood, or a demonic entity disguised as a human. This belief led to horrific tests to force the fairies to return the true child. Parents were sometimes advised to leave the infant on a dunghill overnight, or even worse, to hold the baby over a hot fire or a boiling cauldron. The logic was as cruel as it was simple. If the child was a fairy, it would fly away. If it was human, it was better for it to die than to be a burden on a starving family. But the reality for these mothers was a living hell. If a mother harmed her child in a state of delirium, she wasn't treated as a patient, she was treated as a murderess or a witch. The mother's curse was a very real social fear. A woman who couldn't bond with her child was seen as rejecting the very essence of her womanhood and the gift of God. These women were often confined to dark rooms, tied to beds, or subjected to cold water cures, where they were repeatedly dunked into freezing wells to shock the madness out of their souls. The most disturbing part of this reality was the isolation. Because the birthing room was a female-only space, the early signs of a mother's mental collapse were often hidden by the godsibs to protect her from the law or the church. But when the silence broke and the tragedy became public, the fallout was absolute. The medieval cradle was not always a place of lullabies. It was often a place of silent, suffocating grief, where the line between a mother's love and a mother's madness was blurred by the shadows of a world that didn't understand the mind, only the soul.
In a world governed by the crushing weight of feudalism, a new mouth to feed was often not a blessing, but a death sentence for the entire family. For the peasantry living on the edge of starvation, the arrival of a fourth or fifth child could tip the scales from struggle to total collapse. This led to one of the most disturbing and unspoken realities of the medieval era, the accidental deaths of infants. While the church preached that every life was sacred, the cold reality of an empty larder forced many parents into a state of quiet, desperate ruthlessness. The most common method was a phenomenon known as overlaying. A mother would go to sleep with her infant in her bed, partly for warmth and partly for nursing, and wake up to find the child smothered. While many of these were genuine accidents, historians believe a significant number were pious murders. By claiming she had rolled over in her sleep, a mother could end the child's suffering and her own financial ruin without the immediate intervention of the executioner. However, the church was not easily fooled. If a woman was suspected of overlaying, she was forced to perform public penance, standing at the church door in her shift, barefoot in the snow, holding a candle as a child killer for all the village to see. For those who couldn't bear to look their child in the eyes, there were the secret woods.
Infanticide was a capital crime, but in the dense forests of medieval Europe, it was hauntingly easy to make a newborn disappear. Unwed mothers, fearful of being branded with a hot iron or executed for fornication, would give birth in secret, far from the prying eyes of the midwives. These hidden births often ended with the infant being left in a hollowed tree or a shallow grave lined with moss. The disturbing truth is that the medieval landscape was littered with the tiny, unmarked bones of children who were never meant to exist in the eyes of the law. Even more chilling was the practice of exposure. In times of famine or plague, infants were sometimes left on the doorsteps of local monasteries or in the foundling wheels of large cities. While this seemed more humane, it was often just a slower death. These institutions were overwhelmed, and the mercy they offered was frequently a cold stone floor and a thin diet of water and flour. The mortality rate in these houses of God often exceeded 80%. In the medieval world, the sanctity of life was a luxury that the poor simply could not afford, and the cradle was often traded for a quiet corner of the woods where the only witnesses were the trees and the stars. In an era before genetics or prenatal vitamins, the birth of a child with a visible deformity was not seen as a medical anomaly. It was seen as a message from the heavens or a mark of the devil. When a child was born with a cleft palate, a missing limb, or the neurological tremors of cerebral palsy, the birthing room fell into a terrified, accusing silence. The disturbing truth was that the mother was immediately put on trial by the eyes of her community. It was widely believed that a woman's maternal imagination could physically mold the fetus. If she had looked at a rabbit during pregnancy, her child might have a hare lip. If she had been frightened by a beggar, the child might be born crippled. The fate of these children was often swift and merciless. In many rural villages, a deformed infant was considered a monstrous birth. Because they did not fit the image of God, there were genuine theological debates about whether these infants even possessed a human soul. This ambiguity gave rise to some of the darkest folklore in history, such as the green children or changelings mentioned before. If a child's skin had a yellowish hue from jaundice or a bluish tint from a heart defect, they were treated as alien invaders. Some were subjected to ordeals, rituals where the infant was exposed to extreme cold or left at a crossroads to see if the rightful spiritual parents would claim them. For those who were allowed to live, life was a gauntlet of superstition. Children with port wine stain birthmarks were thought to be touched by fire or cursed by a witch's shadow. Those with Down syndrome were often kept in the shadows, viewed as holy innocents who were perpetually stuck between the world of men and the world of spirits. They were rarely taught trades or integrated into the village. They were the mouths that did not speak, surviving on the scraps of communal charity and the hushed protection of a mother who knew that if she died, her child would likely be left to perish in an almshouse. The most horrific reality, however, was the display. In larger cities, infants born with significant abnormalities were sometimes taken by unscrupulous handlers and displayed in markets as omens. People would pay a copper farthing to see the two-headed Lamb of God or the child with the tail, believing that by witnessing the deformity they could gain insight into the future or avert their own bad luck. The birthing chamber, which was supposed to be a sanctuary, thus became the starting point for a life of exploitation. In the medieval mind, a broken body was a broken soul, and the mercy of the Middle Ages was often a cold, dark room and a life lived in total anonymity.
In the medieval world, the death of a child was not just a family tragedy, it was a spiritual crisis of the highest order. Because of the doctrine of original sin, it was believed that every human was born tainted and could only be cleansed through the water of baptism. If a baby died before the priest could reach the bedside, which happened with terrifying frequency, The grief-stricken parents faced a horror worse than death, the belief that their child's soul was trapped forever in limbo. This was a gray, joyless edge of hell where the unbaptized would never see the face of God, denied entrance to heaven, but spared the fires of the damned. The physical reality of this belief was heart-wrenching. Because they were technically pagans in the eyes of the church, unbaptized infants were forbidden from being buried in consecrated or holy ground. They could not rest in the churchyard alongside their ancestors. Instead, they were buried in the back of the north, the shadow side of the church where the sun never hit, or in God's little acre, a patch of wasteland outside the village walls. In some regions, desperate mothers would secretly bury their stillborn babies under the eaves of their own houses, hoping that the rainwater dripping off the church-blessed roof would wash the grave and provide a symbolic, eternal baptism. This spiritual terror gave rise to the sanctuary of the dead. In parts of Europe, there were certain shrines where it was claimed that a dead infant could be brought back to life for just a few seconds, long enough to be baptized. Mothers would travel for days, carrying the tiny, cold bodies of their children to these altars. They would watch for any sign, a flicker of a candle flame, a slight change in the child's skin color, or a bead of sweat, and claim it as a miracle of breath. The priest would quickly perform the rite, and only then would the mother find the peace to bury her child in holy ground. The disturbing truth of the medieval afterlife for infants was a landscape of exclusion. The church's grip on the afterlife meant that a mother's mourning was often policed by fear. She wasn't allowed to openly weep for a soul in limbo, as it was seen as questioning God's justice. The tiny, unmarked graves that littered the outskirts of medieval villages are the silent witnesses to this era, a time when the church held the keys to the cradle and the grave, and where a few minutes of delay by a priest could mean an eternity of separation for a mother and her child. To look back at the medieval world is to look at a society built upon a foundation of ghosts. When we walk through the ruins of ancient European cathedrals or read the lineages of kings, we often overlook the invisible demographic vacuum created by the birthing chamber. The disturbing truth is that the sheer volume of loss shaped every aspect of human life, from the laws of the land to the very architecture of the home. In many centuries, the average life expectancy was skewed to the low 30s, not because people died of old age at 35, but because the staggering rate of infant and maternal mortality dragged the average into the dirt. For a medieval woman, life was a cycle of perpetual pregnancy. Because so many children died in infancy, a woman had to give birth to 8, 10, or 12 children just to ensure that 2 or 3 might reach adulthood. This meant her body was in a constant state of depletion. Her bones were softened by a lack of calcium, her teeth rotted as the growing fetuses stole her minerals, and her immune system was perpetually compromised. The final toll was not just measured in deaths, but in the physical exhaustion of the survivors. A woman who reached the age of 40 was often physically aged to 60, her body a map of the battles she had fought in the birthing room. This cycle of loss created a culture of emotional distance that is jarring to the modern mind. Historians often debate whether medieval parents loved their children less because they expected them to die. While the grief was undoubtedly real, the societal coping mechanism was one of guardedness. You didn't name a child until they survived the first week. Sometimes you gave a new baby the same name as a deceased sibling, treating the name as a vessel that the next child simply stepped into. This was a world where a mother's lullaby was often a prayer for a quick death rather than a long, suffering life in a world of plague and hunger. As we conclude this journey into the darkness of medieval childbirth, we are left with a profound sense of the resilience of the human spirit. These women walked into the shadow of death time and time again, armed with nothing but faith and the hands of their friends. They faced the crotchet, the fever, and the cold reality of limbo with a courage that is almost incomprehensible today.
When we look at the disturbing truth, we aren't just looking at primitive medicine. We're looking at the heavy price our ancestors paid for our existence. Every one of us is the descendant of a woman who survived the most dangerous room in history.
While the peasant woman feared starvation and the secret woods, the queens and noblewomen of the Middle Ages faced a different, perhaps more psychological horror. For a royal consort, her womb was not her own, it was state property. The disturbing truth of royal childbirth was that a queen's survival was often secondary to the production of a spare and an heir. From the moment the marriage was consummated, the queen was under a relentless public microscope. Every month that passed without a swelling belly was seen as a political failure, a divine snub, or a sign of female weakness that could lead to her being cast aside, annulled, or replaced. When a royal birth drew near, the queen was subjected to a ritual known as confinement. Weeks before the due date, she was locked away in a room where the windows were boarded up and the tapestries were pinned tight to exclude all light and fresh air. This was intended to create a womb-like environment to protect the royal infant, but in reality, it created a stifling, claustrophobic oven. Surrounded only by women, she lived in a dim, stagnant world of flickering candles and incense, her anxiety mounting as the court outside placed bets on the gender of the child and the survival of the mother. The birth itself was a public-private spectacle. While men were excluded from the room, the highest-ranking noblewomen and officials would wait just outside the door, listening to every scream. The pressure to produce a male heir was so immense that many queens suffered from phantom pregnancies or extreme mental breakdowns during labor. If a girl was born, the disappointment in the palace was palpable. The bells did not ring as long, and the mother was often blamed for the failure. If she died giving birth to a daughter, she was remembered as a tragedy. If she died giving birth to a son, she was hailed as a martyr who had fulfilled her only true purpose. The most chilling aspect of royal life was the post-mortem extraction mentioned earlier, which was even more strictly enforced in royal circles. If a queen died with the heir still inside, surgeons would not hesitate to mutilate her body instantly to save the crown's future. There was no dignity in death for a royal mother. She was a vessel, and once the vessel was broken, the contents were all that mattered. This golden cage meant that the most powerful women in the world lived in constant terror of their own biology, knowing that their greatest moment of glory, the birth of a king, was the very thing most likely to kill them. In the mid-14th century, a new horror descended upon the world that would inadvertently change the birthing chamber forever: the bubonic plague. As the Black Death wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, the traditional structures of the village and the church crumbled. With death becoming a constant daily companion, the disturbing truth took a sharp turn. Suddenly, there was a desperate, panicky need to repopulate. The scarcity of human life made every surviving infant more valuable than gold, and this shift in value began to pull the midwife out of the realm of folk magic and into a world of early regulation. Because so many experienced godsibs had died in the plague, a vacuum of knowledge was left behind. Young, inexperienced women were forced into the role of midwife without the years of oral tradition typically passed down. To prevent malpractice and to ensure that as many babies survived as possible, local authorities and the church began to issue midwifery oaths. For the first time, midwives had to be licensed. However, this wasn't about medical skill, it was about moral policing. They had to swear they wouldn't use witchcraft, wouldn't eat the placenta, and wouldn't hide the identity of a child's father. Despite the heavy-handed oversight, the post-plague era saw a strange evolution in tools. Midwives began to share secrets more openly. We see the emergence of the first printed birthing manuals, such as the Rose Garden for pregnant women.
These books were filled with woodcut illustrations showing the various positions of a baby in the womb. For the first time, women and the few literate men who read to them could visualize the invisible world inside the body. It was a crude, anatomical awakening born from the ashes of a pandemic. Yet this progress came with a dark side. As the church and the emerging medical professionals, men, began to see how vital childbirth was to the economy, they began to push the independent midwife aside. The wise woman of the village, once respected as a healer, was now viewed with suspicion by the male-dominated church. If a birth went wrong, she was no longer just unlucky, she was a maleficus or a witch. This transition marked the beginning of the end for the sacred female-only space of the birthing room. The battle for the womb was moving from the hands of the mother to the control of the state, a legacy of the Black Death that would echo for centuries.
The emotional landscape of a medieval village was haunted by the voices of those who never made it out of the birthing chamber. Because death was so frequent, it became woven into the folklore and the nightmare logic of the age. The disturbing truth of medieval grief was that it had no private place to go. It was transformed into ghost stories that served as warnings for the living. The most terrifying of these was the legend of the Lianan Sea, or the White Ladies, spirits of women who had died in childbirth and were destined to wander the earth, forever searching for the infants they were forced to leave behind. These spirits were said to haunt the crossroads and the riverbanks, their white burial shrouds trailing in the mud. In many cultures, it was believed that if a woman died in labor, she remained in a state of unrest because she had died with an unfinished task. To prevent her spirit from returning to claim her living husband or the surviving child, strange and macabre rituals were performed at her funeral. In some regions, the feet of the deceased mother were bound together, or her body was carried out of the house through a hole cut in the wall, which was immediately bricked up so that her ghost could not find the door to return home. The folklore wasn't just about the mothers, it was about the grave-bound infants. There were tales of milingers, the ghosts of unbaptized children who would jump on the backs of travelers, demanding to be carried to holy ground or given a name. These stories reflected the deep subconscious guilt of a society that routinely saw its youngest members perish. The weeping woods were said to echo with the cries of the exposed infants, a psychological manifestation of the collective trauma of parents who had been forced by poverty to abandon their young. This atmosphere of living with the dead meant that mourning was a permanent state of being. A woman might wear a memento mori ring, a piece of jewelry featuring a skull or a tiny coffin, not as a fashion statement, but as a grim reminder that her next pregnancy could be her last. These ghost stories were the medieval way of processing the unbearable. By turning the tragedy of a lost mother into a white lady, the community gave a name to the void left behind. It was a world where the veil between the nursery and the graveyard was paper thin, and the wind rattling the shutters wasn't just a storm. It was the sound of a mother who still hadn't found her way to the cradle. As the Middle Ages drew to a close and the Renaissance began to flicker on the horizon, a dark cloud gathered over the women who held the secrets of life and death. The disturbing truth of this era was the transformation of the midwife from a community healer into a target of the Inquisition. The very skills that made a midwife essential, her knowledge of herbal pain relief, her ability to turn a baby in the womb, and her presence at the moment of birth, became the evidence used to burn her at the stake. The church grew increasingly suspicious of women's secrets. In the eyes of the patriarchy, if a midwife could ease the pain of labor, she was defying the biblical decree that women must suffer. If she used ergot to stop a hemorrhage or willow bark to dull a fever, it wasn't seen as medicine, it was seen as a pact with the devil to circumvent God's will.
The infamous manual, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, explicitly stated that no one does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives. This sparked a period of state-sponsored terror in the birthing room. Midwives were accused of offering unbaptized infants to Satan, or using the umbilical cords and placentas in unholy rituals. This wasn't just religious hysteria, it was a power grab. By branding midwives as witches, the male-dominated medical establishment and the church could seize control over the reproductive process. If a baby was born dead, the midwife was no longer just a mourning witness, she was a suspect. She was searched for the witch's mark, a mole or a birthmark that supposedly proved her allegiance to the dark arts. The impact on childbirth was devastating. Fearing for their lives, many midwives stopped using effective herbal remedies, reverting to safer but useless prayers to avoid any suspicion of magic. Knowledge that had been passed down for 1,000 years was lost or hidden in the shadows. The birthing room, once a sanctuary of female solidarity, became a place of paranoia where one wrong word could lead to the gallows. The witch hunts ensured that for decades, the progress of maternal health didn't just stall, it regressed, leaving mothers more vulnerable than ever to the cold, clinical, and often more dangerous interventions of the early man midwives.
The end of the 17th century brought about one of the most guarded secrets in medical history, a secret that would change the birthing room from a female-led sanctuary into a male-dominated theater of technology. This was the era of the Chamberlain family, a dynasty of man midwives who possessed a mysterious tool that could supposedly pull a living child from a dying mother. This tool was the forceps. For over a century, the Chamberlains kept this device hidden in a gilded box, carrying it into birthing rooms only after all women had been cleared out. They worked under a cloth, blindfolded the mother, and used the clinking metal in secret to maintain their monopoly on miraculous deliveries. The disturbing truth of the forceps was their brutal misuse. When the secret finally leaked and man midwives became a fashionable trend for the wealthy, these metal tongs were often used prematurely. Men who were trained as surgeons rather than caregivers often viewed birth as a mechanical problem to be solved with force. Without the patience of the traditional midwife, they would apply the iron blades to the infant's soft skull too early. The results were often catastrophic: crushed skulls, permanent facial nerve damage, and horrific internal tearing for the mother. The rise of the man midwife also introduced a new layer of social shame. For a man to touch a woman's private parts, even in a medical emergency, was considered scandalous. To maintain decency, the man midwife would often work entirely by touch, his arms tucked under a large sheet while he looked away, or he would crawl on the floor to avoid making eye contact with the laboring woman. This blind surgery was incredibly dangerous. One slip of the metal blade could cause a fatal hemorrhage, yet the prestige of having a doctor present was so great that noble families continued to risk it. This shift signaled the final death knell for the medieval tradition. The intuitive, herb-based, and patient-centric world of the village midwife was being replaced by the cold, metallic, and often impatient world of the male surgeon. The birthing room was no longer just a place of life, it had become a place of intervention. While the forceps would eventually save countless lives once understood, their early years were marked by a trail of broken bodies and a secret kept for profit, proving that even in the pursuit of progress, the mother's body remained a battlefield for control and coin. As we look back at the spiritual life of a medieval mother, we encounter one of the most bizarre and disturbing obsessions of the Church, the cult of the holy milk.
In a world where so many mothers died before they could nurse, and so many infants withered away from dry hunger, the breast milk of the Virgin Mary became a symbol of ultimate life-saving power. It wasn't just a metaphor. The Church claimed to possess physical vials of Mary's milk, which were paraded through streets during times of famine or plague. The disturbing truth lay in how this was used to guilt-trip living women. Art from this period often depicted St. Bernard's lactation, where the Virgin Mary sprays milk from her breast into the mouth of a kneeling saint. This imagery sent a clear, terrifying message to medieval women. Your milk is not just food, it is a sacred duty. If a mother's milk dried up due to the very real stresses of malnutrition or grief, she was told it was a sign of her impurity or a lack of faith. This obsession led to the use of holy milk relics as a form of medicine. If a woman was struggling with a painful breast infection, mastitis, she might be told to pray to a vial of dust that was claimed to be dried milk from the Holy Land. Instead of practical poultices or drainage, she was given spiritual cures that allowed the infection to turn into a fatal abscess. The Church glorified the idea of the nursing mother while simultaneously ignoring the agony of the actual woman. It was a peak of medieval irony. The world worshipped the image of a mother's breast, while the women themselves were dying in the gutters for lack of basic care and nutrition.
As the 17th century bled into the 18th, the medieval trauma of loss didn't disappear. It became formalized into a sophisticated and disturbing cult of death. Because the birthing chamber remained a place where 1 in 3 women expected to greet the grave, the culture developed an obsession with physical reminders of the departed. This was the era of memento mori jewelry, specifically mourning rings. These weren't just simple tokens of remembrance, they were often macabre, containing the actual hair of the mother who died in labor or the infant who never drew a breath, woven into intricate patterns behind glass. The disturbing truth of these artifacts was their ubiquity. It was common for a wealthy woman to own a collection of these rings, each representing a child she had lost or a friend who had succumbed to childbed fever. Some rings featured tiny hand-painted skeletons or chrisom babies, infants wrapped in funeral shrouds. These weren't seen as morbid by the standards of the time. They were a necessary architecture of memory. In a world where life was fleeting, the only way to hold on to a person was to carry a piece of their body, their hair, with you at all times. For the poor who couldn't afford gold and enamel, the memory was kept in the ghost cradle. In many rural European villages, if a baby died, the cradle was not sold or thrown away. It was kept in the corner of the room, often covered with a black cloth. It served as a silent, haunting monument to what should have been. This constant presence of death in the domestic space meant that children grew up playing in the shadow of their deceased siblings' belongings. Grief wasn't a stage you moved through, it was a permanent member of the household. The most chilling manifestation of this memory culture was the funeral portrait. If a noble child died, a painter was often rushed to the house to capture the infant's likeness before the body was interred. These sleeping portraits were hung in the family galleries, indistinguishable from portraits of living children, except for the presence of a wilted lily or a bird flying away in the background. It created a house of mirrors where the living and the dead coexisted, a testament to a time when the joy of birth was so inextricably linked to the sorrow of the shroud that the two could never be truly separated. We have walked through the blood-stained birthing rooms, witnessed the horror of the crochet, felt the chill of the unbaptized grave, and seen the secret tools of the man midwife. But why does this disturbing truth matter today? The final chapter of this medieval saga is not found in a history book, but in our own DNA. We are the survivors.
every person alive today is the end result of a 1,000-year-old lottery where the stakes were life and death. The scars of medieval childbirth shaped modern medicine. The horrors of the invisible killer led to the discovery of hand-washing by Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s, a discovery that was initially rejected by doctors who felt insulted by the idea that their hands could be unclean. The brutality of the forceps led to the development of the modern C-section, which, while still a major surgery, is a miracle compared to the post-mortem extraction of the 14th century. We live in an era of medicalized birth, specifically because our ancestors' experience of natural birth was so frequently a massacre. However, the shadow of the Middle Ages still lingers. In many parts of the world today, the conditions of the medieval birthing room, lack of clean water, absence of trained help, and the prioritization of tradition over science are still a daily reality. The disturbing truth is that for millions of women, the 14th century has never ended. As we look back at the flickering tallow candles and the godsibs whispering prayers, we're reminded that the safety we enjoy today is a fragile, hard-won prize. The history of childbirth is the history of human pain, but more importantly, it is the history of the incredible, unbreakable will of women to bring life into a world that was often determined to take it away.
As the medieval era slowly dissolved into the early modern age, the most disturbing truth wasn't just the lack of medical knowledge, it was the active resistance to making birth easier. For centuries, the shadow of Eve's curse loomed so large that the idea of a painless birth was seen as a rebellion against God. When the first primitive forms of anesthesia, like ether and chloroform, were discovered in the mid-19th century, the loudest voices of opposition came from the pulpit. Preachers argued that the pang of the womb was a holy suffering that refined a woman's soul. To remove the pain was to remove the penance. This religious gatekeeping meant that for decades after the technology existed, women were still forced to endure the white-knuckle agony of the birthing chair. Doctors themselves were divided. Some believed that pain was a necessary stimulant to keep the mother's heart beating. They feared that if a woman was unconscious or numbed, her body would forget how to push, leading to a dead birth. It was a world where a woman's physical suffering was romanticized by men who would never have to feel a single contraction. The turning point came not from a scientist, but from a queen. In 1853, Queen Victoria, exhausted by her previous 7 labors, demanded chloroform for the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. When the most powerful woman on earth declared that the blessed chloroform was soothing and delightful beyond measure, the religious arguments began to crumble. If the defender of the faith could use pain relief, then surely the average woman could too. However, this mercy came with a dark side. The use of chloroform led to the era of twilight sleep in the early 20th century, a practice where women were injected with morphine and scopolamine. While it took away the pain, it also erased their memory and left them in a state of drug-induced psychosis, often resulting in babies born blue and struggling to breathe. The journey toward a safe, painless birth was paved with experiments that treated women like laboratory animals. The medieval belief that a mother must suffer was simply replaced by a new era where her control over her own body was sacrificed for a chemical haze. Even as technology advanced, one medieval shadow refused to retreat: the milk fever. Into the 1840s, hospitals, which were supposed to be sanctuaries of healing, became the most dangerous places in the world to give birth. In the grand wards of Vienna and London, the mortality rate for mothers was often higher than it had been in the drafty peasant huts of the 14th century. The reason was a horrifying irony: the gentleman doctors. A young doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed a disturbing pattern. In the ward where medical students handled births, women were dying in droves. In the ward where humble midwives handled births, the death rate was significantly lower.
The difference was that the medical students were coming directly from the morgue, where they had been dissecting cadavers, to the birthing ward to examine living women. They were carrying cadaverous particles, deadly bacteria on their unwashed hands, sowing death directly into the wombs of the living. When Semmelweis suggested that doctors should simply wash their hands in a chlorine solution, he was met with mockery and rage. The medical establishment felt that the suggestion that a gentleman's hands could be unclean was a personal insult. Semmelweis was eventually driven to a mental asylum where he died from the very same infection he had tried to prevent. It took another 40 years for his disturbing truth to be accepted. This remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of childbirth. The fact that thousands, perhaps millions of women died not because of God's will or fate, but because of the ego and arrogance of the men who claimed to be their saviors. The transition from the medieval midwife to the modern surgeon was not a straight line of progress. It was a bloody, jagged path where the victims were almost always the mothers. The miracle of birth as we know it today was built upon the bodies of those who were sacrificed to the pride of a medical elite that refused to wash their hands.
In the medieval and early modern mind, a newborn baby was not seen as a perfect, developing being, but as something soft, malleable, and dangerously unformed. There was a deep-seated fear that if a baby's limbs were left free, they would grow crooked, or worse, the child would crawl on all fours like an animal, losing its God-given human uprightness. This led to the practice of swaddling, a ritual that turned the first months of a child's life into a period of total immobilization. The disturbing truth of swaddling was far more intense than the gentle burrito wrap used by parents today. Medieval infants were bound in long, narrow strips of linen or wool, wrapped so tightly from the neck to the toes that they could not move a single muscle. Their arms were pinned to their sides, and their legs were forced into a straight, rigid line. It was believed that this binding would strengthen the bones, but in reality, it caused a host of horrors. The lack of movement led to muscle atrophy and hip dysplasia. Even more disturbing was the hygiene, or lack thereof. Because it took so long to unwrap and rewrap a child, babies were often left in their own waste for days at a time. The acidic urine and feces would sit against the skin, causing diaper rash so severe it led to open sores and secondary infections. In many cases, the swaddling bands became a breeding ground for lice and mites. The child's first experience of the world was one of suffocating heat, constant dampness, and a complete inability to explore their own body. This practice also served a darker, more practical purpose for the overworked peasantry. It made the baby stowable. A swaddled infant could be hung from a peg on the wall or leaned against a chair like a piece of furniture while the mother worked in the fields. There are harrowing accounts of swaddled babies being attacked by domestic animals or even pigs while their mothers were away, the children unable to cry out or move to defend themselves. The medieval cradle was often less of a bed and more of a temporary coffin designed to restrain the wildness of infancy at the cost of the child's basic comfort and health. In the modern delivery room, the placenta is often treated as medical waste. In the medieval world, it was a powerful, mystical object that held the secret to the mother's future fertility and the child's destiny. The disturbing truth of the afterbirth was that it was often the center of a series of occult rituals that would have horrified the local priest. The midwife was responsible for the disposal of the placenta, and how she did it was believed to dictate whether the mother would ever conceive again. If a mother wanted more children, the placenta might be buried under a fruit-bearing tree, symbolizing growth and abundance. If she was done with the sorrow of the womb, the midwife might burn the placenta in a ritual fire, believing that the heat would dry up the mother's internal humors and prevent further pregnancies.
In many darker folk traditions, pieces of the dried umbilical cord were kept as amulets to ward off the evil eye, or were even ground into powders to be slipped into the father's drink to ensure his loyalty. The church viewed these practices with absolute loathing. They saw the placenta rituals as a form of blood magic that tied the woman to the earth rather than to heaven. This was often the primary evidence used in witch trials. A midwife caught hiding a placenta was seen as a servant of the devil. But for the women, these rituals were the only form of control they had over their own reproductive lives. In a world where they couldn't choose when to get pregnant, the magic of the placenta was their silent protest, a desperate attempt to negotiate with the forces of nature that so often tried to kill them. As the fires of the Inquisition grew hotter, these traditions were pushed deeper into the shadows. The transition to modern medicine meant the stripping away of these rituals, replacing the magic of the earth with the cold steel of the clinic. While the medicine saved lives, something of the communal, female-centric spiritual experience was lost. The placenta went from being a sacred twin of the baby to a discarded scrap of flesh, marking the final shift in how humanity viewed the mystery of life.